qualifies for Today's session qualifies for 0.5 crop management CCA CEUs. We'll put the slide up with the information that you need and the QR code at the end. This talk will be about 20 minutes long, and we'll try to leave about 10 minutes for questions at the end. Please, if a question occurs to you, throw it in the chat. Don't be shy about that. And either I'll read it out at the end, or you can just unmute yourself and speak up at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available along with the slides on the UVM website pretty quickly. There are closed captioning services if you need them. Please see the chat where Emily, our kind captioner, has thrown the information. And so with that, today's speaker is Arthur Siller, an extension educator with the University of Massachusetts Amherst and an NECCC board member. Arthur's specialties include soil health and management and cover crops. They are completing their PhD in plant and soil sciences, where the topic of research is extending the grazing season with creative forage systems. Arthur, thank you for speaking today. The screen is yours.
Welcome everyone again. I'm just gonna share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, so I happy to be here today sharing work on experiments that we're doing on winter legume productivity in the Northeast. We will have further results from these experiments as time goes on, but excited to share some of our earlier results with you all here today and to hear any thoughts about people may have and talk more in depth either now or another time. My contact information is here on the slide, and I'm very happy to talk about this topic or other things that people want to chat about. So first, I'll just say that our joint research team for this project includes 6 universities from around the Northeast. The results that I'm going to be talking about today come from Maine, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. For the full results that we'll have after this next season, we'll also have data from Delaware and New Jersey included, and that's a great team. And today our research goal is to better understand winter survival and spring growth of winter legume cover crops in a changing climate. So trying to work on our climate adaptation as we get used to warmer winters, specifically in this project. So these experiments had several factors. We had 4 legume species. We also had the use of grass companion crops with the legumes. And we also looked at planting time. And here you can see, there'll be a bunch of pictures of some of the different legumes. This is kind of like what one of the trials looked like. You can see the different crops out here. So our 4 legume species were balanza clover, crimson clover, winter pea, and hairy vetch as something of a control for our northern areas. We wanted to be able to see how some of the legumes that haven't historically made it through the winter in the northern tier of the Northeast, being crimson clover and winter pea, and balanza clover, which is relatively new in availability in the area at least. So we grew the legumes with oats or with rye or with no grass companion as a solo crop. We wanted here to see how if the grass would be competing with the legumes or potentially sheltering them. So we're looking at whether we see better winter survival in with some of the legumes and how it affects the spring mass. Finally, our last treatment was the planting time. So we planted in each location 6 weeks before a typical frost. For the data I'm talking about today, that's mid-August to early September, and 3 weeks before a typical first frost, and that's early to late September. Now, when we're measuring a typical first frost, we are trying to use the most recent data available and to some extent be incorporating the kind of frosts that we're seeing now, but things seem to keep getting warmer a lot of years, and so it was certainly more than 6 and 3 weeks before our first frost for some of the locations last year. When we look at our measurements, we counted how many legumes and grass seedlings there were 3 weeks after planting. We measured the leaf coverage area using Canopeo app in the spring at Green Up, about this kind of growth stage that you see in this picture. And then in late spring at rye heading, we measured the cover crop biomass as well as the weed biomass for each treatment. We are going to be getting data on the nitrogen content of the cover crops as well, but we don't have that in hand yet. Today I'll be looking at a little bit on the stand count, but mostly looking at the cover crop biomass data. So again, to give you a little bit of an idea of our research locations, you can see that they really cover the breadth of the geographic area that we have in the Northeast, from our northern locations in Vermont and Maine to all the way out west in Pennsylvania and all the way down south to Delaware. So we should be able to get a good geographic spread, and I do think that that's going to end up playing an interesting role in the results. So given that we have such different environments, we do think it's important to look at the weather conditions. And while we haven't had time to really dig into the weather too much on this data till we have all of our data in hand next year, we do see that there were some differences between our locations in that Massachusetts and Pennsylvania were considerably warmer in the winter and spring compared to Maine and Vermont. Not too surprising there, but it's notable to see that we've got probably about something around 5 degrees average temperature difference between those locations. And when we have data from New Jersey and Delaware, we may, especially Delaware, likely will be a little bit warmer than any of the others. We also saw that there were pretty big differences in precipitation, with Pennsylvania and Vermont generally being quite a bit drier than Maine and Massachusetts. So when we aggregate everything kind of and look at the different, just very big picture, what's happening with legume biomass in these 4 states and our planting dates, what we see is that we actually have really divergent results on the effective planting date for legumes, with Massachusetts and Maine, the early planting date performing much better, and Pennsylvania and Vermont, the later planting date performing much better. We don't see that effect with our grass biomass in the spring. There's small differences, but none of them are significant. And as we look at this, I also want to sort of point out a few things with the figures that I'm going to be showing. The asterisks that you'll see at the top of each graph will show whether the differences that we see between the states, or whatever the larger factor of the graph is, are statistically significant. So in this case, we can see that for the legumes, Maine had the lowest overall legume biomass. And then Pennsylvania and Vermont, while they might have a little bit different biomass, they were about the same. from a mathematical perspective, and Massachusetts had the highest legume biomass. Then when we see the letters in each graph, when there's the same letter, that means that even though there might be a slight difference in the bars of the graphs, they're pretty close, and we wouldn't necessarily expect to see that. We wouldn't be surprised if those bars were reversed in a second year or in another trial location. But don't worry too much about that if that feels overwhelming. It's not the main point of this presentation. I didn't want that notation to feel mysterious to me. So now when we look at the effect of our companion crops, our grasses, on spring biomass, we see that unsurprisingly, the type of grass does affect the grass biomass in the spring. We did have some oats make it through the winter last year. It was a very mild winter, and in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania particularly, we did see some oats make it through the winter. We didn't see any oats make it through the winter in Vermont, and only just a smidgen in Maine. Whereas in all the states, the rye made it through the winter just fine. And we see, quite a high biomass of rye where we had that in the treatments. We also see that in all the states, we see the effect of grass companion crop on the legume biomass. Now, we don't see that in Maine. We don't see an effect from either of the grass companion crops. But for the other three states, we do see, and Maine had, I think that may be because Maine had relatively low legume growth overall. But we do see in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania that the oats had no effect on the spring biomass, whereas the oats, the purple bar, did reduce the spring biomass in Vermont, and then rye reduced the spring biomass in all three. We'll come back to that a little bit more later, looking at if there are any differences between types of legumes as well. So we can kind of reverse that as well and see, okay, how does the type of legume in each state affect the legume biomass and grass biomass? We'll jump ahead over to the right graph here, and you can see with the grass biomass, the lack of any letters on here is showing that, yeah, there might have been small differences between, say, the crimson clover in Pennsylvania and the balanza clover in Pennsylvania, but they really weren't very meaningful differences. The type of, none of the legumes seem to be competing very much with, particularly the rye in this case, is what's making up this grass biomass. On the other hand, we do see pretty big differences between the legume species themselves in terms of the legume biomass in the spring. We see crimson clover performing pretty well, across the board here. Vetch generally being pretty good in Massachusetts, only okay in the other states, and balanza clover being kind of okay generally, and pea is not doing very well. We had a lot of issues with pea emergence. So now when we break it down into our different states, we can see, and then now that we're breaking it down into the states, we can put that out by planting as well. So we can see, again, for each of these species, that the early planting in Massachusetts and Maine was better, but worse in Pennsylvania and Vermont. We also see that, the vetch was pretty consistent in Massachusetts, but, relatively did see some effects in Maine and Pennsylvania on the vetch, depending on the planting date. overall, I think we see that crimson clover did pretty well compared to other legumes as a general rule, and that balansa clover is pretty inconsistent. One thing I will note that's important to look at here is that we see there's a lot of differences between the legumes, but we do tend to see a pretty similar trend from one planting date to another planting date within a state. So to give an example, in Vermont, balansa clover, crimson clover, and hairy vetch, as well as winter pea a little bit, they were all higher at the late planting. We don't really see anything where, balansa clovers going down from early planting to late planting, and crimson clovers going up from early planting to late planting. Now there's some things that are pretty similar from one planting date to another, but it does seem like there's we're not seeing a big, once we account for the environmental effects, we're not seeing, some legumes respond better in any of the, to the cooler late weather than others as a general rule here. So now when we look at the effect of our grass on our legume biomass, we see we're going to break it out for each legume here. And we can see, yeah, we don't really see much of a difference with the peas, but that's just because there really were so few peas in these plots that the variation is very high. And we also, again, we can see that, we tend to see not a huge difference between each legume in a given state with how they're responding to the different grasses. So in Vermont, oats are impacting the spring growth for all of balansa clover, crimson clover, and hairy vetch. And generally, when we look at Pennsylvania, oats are not having a big reduction on any of those legumes in Pennsylvania. When we look at Maine, unlike the other states, rye isn't reducing any of the legumes in a substantial way. So this does lead to see, again, that the legumes, it's not really that some of these legumes appear to be much better at competing with rye, as much as something about the environment is causing rye to be more competitive in some of the situations, or across the board being not so great for legumes. So we wanted to try and think a little bit more about what might be causing these differences by coming back and looking at here. We're going to look at our stand counts of legumes in the fall. So this was measured 3 weeks after planting compared to our legume biomass in the spring. And you can see the colors are our different legume species here. There are triangles and circles based on our planting time, but I wouldn't worry about that too much. I don't think it's super interesting, but if you want to examine the slides later from the website, you can think about it more. I'm not saying there's nothing there, but not the focus right now, I suppose. The main thing that we see is outside of very low populations, we don't see a really strong trend with the legume population in the fall and our spring biomass. So I do think looks like there's a little bit of a trend at the low populations. Like if we just have 1 or 2 peas in a plot, that it's not going to be a big biomass, but we can see the purple as our hairy vetch, and even with pretty low populations, some of those low populations don't have a lot of biomass, but some of them do have a lot of biomass. And so it really, shows some of the plasticity of these legumes to grow, fairly large if they've got a little more space likely. So we also wanted to look at our weed growth and see, okay, are we seeing differences in legumes based on, are they getting competed with by weeds a lot? And again, we don't really see a very strong trend here of lots of weeds means very little legumes, or few weeds means lots of legumes. Um, and obviously the species are kind of intermixed here because we get different amounts of the weeds are not sorting out in the way that the populations did. Finally, for these figures, we looked at our grass biomass versus our legume biomass. Because remember, we did see that that rye, which had a high biomass, did reduce legume biomass generally. And I think we see that somewhat confirmed here. It's not the strongest relationship that you can imagine, but we do see that at the high end of when you have a lot of grass biomass, we're not seeing the data points that show a lot of legume biomass. Some of the low grass biomass, we still have low legume biomass. But outside, and in Massachusetts, we did have a few plots that had pretty high grass biomass and high legume biomass. But overall, it does look like when you have a lot of grass biomass, that's not great for getting a lot of legume biomass. Now, it may be that I don't think we can quite say that, it may be that that is somewhat related to there not being that many legumes in that plot and the grass doing really well. So it could go kind of both ways, but given that we didn't see the type of legume affecting the grass biomass either, it seems likely that in situations where you have a lot of rye growing, which is everything that's in the high biomass area here, that is not great for getting a ton of legume biomass. So to summarize a little bit what we found so far, one of the main goals of this research was to see, well, are these legumes even viable in some of our northern areas? And I think we saw that, yeah, they were, and even winter peas, which I think the emergence issue with peas is kind of generally an issue that's being worked on. And so I would say I think peas are a good option for, despite our research, which has very low biomass, what didn't seem to be an issue of peas not surviving the winter or being damaged by the cold weather, but an issue around seedling emergence. Even though the seeds had good germination, something was happening after they got planted where a lot of them weren't making it. And we did find, a pretty consistent trend of rye reducing spring biomass much more than oats did, and relative to a monoculture. So obviously there's lots of other benefits to rye, so that's not the be all and end all of whether rye is a good plant to grow with legumes. And so this leaves us with kind of a few questions that we're trying to get into. We saw really inconsistent effects of our planting timing, and so getting into the weather data and trying to see if there's anything more specific than, we know it was a drier fall in Vermont, but specifically when did they get rain relative to different planting activities, and was there kind of getting into the specific differences between the different locations? It's going to be important trying to tease out what's going on with the differences there. And we're really looking forward to getting our lab results back to be able to talk about the nitrogen benefits and the carbon nitrogen ratio that the different treatments are showing. So our next steps that we're looking at, we've got a second year of field research underway. Everything's planted. I think everything's planted, but if not, maybe there's some of the southern states may still be putting in their second planting. And getting our stand counts, getting ready to harvest next spring. and yeah, getting our labs there. So thanks everybody for being here. This is a joint research project organized by the Northeast Cover Crop Council, and we do have some funding from the New England Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, as well as all of our, university partners who are contributing time and resources to this project. Thanks. I guess I'll leave the slides up in case we need to look at anything for questions.
Thanks, Arthur, sorry. Great presentation. Actually, I do think we're going to go on ahead and very quickly switch the slides over to the QR codes, but we do have a few minutes for questions. So I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Does anybody have anything they want to ask Arthur? Don't be shy, y'all. Well, Arthur, I do have a question. You think something's happening to those pea seeds because you said you have good germination. Any thoughts on what's eating them? Microfauna or macrofauna or some mix of the two?
I don't know, but I was, I wasn't sure. It was pretty consistent across sites in our first year, and I rechecked the germination this summer to say, okay, like maybe we just need to get some new seed, and it was fine. But then I also was working, helping with being a location for the winter pea trials that Solveig Hansen was organizing out of Cornell. And so I planted some of our pea variety with the ones that she had sent, and they all looked really way better. So it does seem to be an issue with the peas themselves, not like this particular variety of pea seems to have low seedling vigor of some sort.
Gotcha.
But...
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions now. Emily asks, when do you perform stand counts and final biomass weights?
So the stand counts are done 3 weeks after planting. So it depends on exactly when people plant. And that's just timing to essentially make sure most everything has come up, but we don't have a lot of tillering that makes it super hard to count individuals. And then the biomass is timed with the early planting date rye heading. So that's going to also vary from location to location. In Massachusetts, that was like early May this year, but definitely vary from state to state.
Thank you. And then Kara asks, how did you decide which species to include? Do you have any insights into when Balanza clover is a good choice or any problems with it?
Yeah, so we picked crimson clover and winter peas because people have been experimenting with them on farms and also research stations as well, and having pretty good results. We kind of wanted to see what the range of that was. And then with Balanza clover, it was just something that we were interested in, having seen it on the market and reading that it had good winter hardiness. I think from a very anecdotal perspective on the Balanza clover, it's a much smaller seeded clover. The seeds are more like a red clover or a white clover in terms of sort of seedling vigor in the fall. And so I don't think it's probably very suitable for anywhere that you have like high winter annual weed pressure. And I do think looking at that will be an interesting question overall of what kind of cropping systems are suitable for it, but it can be a pretty nice stand if it gets in there. You definitely have to, it's a little bit tricky to plant with a larger seeded crop like an oat or a rye because of the differences in planting depth. So you need, I think ideally you'd have a small seed box for the balanza as well, you know, on a drill or something like that, in order to not get it too deeply in the ground.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So we have reached 12:30 and then some. So if you need to register that you attended this, please do go on ahead and use the QR code or otherwise follow the instructions on your screen. I would like to offer author Arthur another thank you for speaking today. Great presentation. We're going to go on ahead and stop recording. If anyone does have any other questions that come up,